We're late, we better get started. Otherwise, you'll decide that it's time to leave. I've thought about trying an experiment sometime, but I'm not convinced it's going to work out very well. Of doing my part first and letting you answer the questions afterwards. I know, and I am very ready to acknowledge that it would be, lots of people would say it's beneficial, but my concern is that you would decide the questions aren't important and then you'd start leaving. You wouldn't feel as committed to stay if I talked first and you were answering questions second. I could be persuaded otherwise, but I think I've got a beat on it.
But I think it's good for us to think through the questions.
That's part of why I like you guys to tackle questions first, is because one of the biggest dangers in Bible study is that you think Father knows the answer and you don't. Yeah. And in a lot of cases, it's far better to say it maybe more like, Father has thought through some of these questions and he has an answer, and we're curious what that answer is. But you guys can learn and speak to just about as much as I can. You even have my notes, which is more or less what I'm thinking about it. And there's lots of notes. If you've noticed, it goes to 171 pages now. I didn't think when I was starting this that I was writing a book, and I feel like I wouldn't have very far to go to actually write a book. My commentary would be longer than his, though, because I think there's more to it. So one of the challenges in this kind of section, this is like in the middle of 148, in the house of Mason or Manason, or however you want to say his name, the Cypriot, is how to see. So much of the book of Acts lies at the intersection of Judaism and Christianity and Romans and religion and politics. It's sort of all caught up, and it's a hard place to talk about well and to describe well, because part of it is that, when I'm preparing this, I'm like, well, I wonder what it is like. There's scholars that have done lots of research, and just like you, I have to go read what they say, because I have some guesses, and I know from some different sources about some of it, but it's hard to kind of communicate the situation on the ground, because we tend to think of it sort of like modern America. We're always reading our modern times back into the Bible. And in this way, you could say this is part of what modern scholarship talks about when we approach the text with a bias. It doesn't mean that our bias is always wrong, but there's just things like you're reading about the encounters of Paul and the synagogue, and you imagine, probably like me, that synagogue services are sort of like church services, but they have more people that preach, and okay, we can figure that out. So it's this large, peaceful crowd sitting around, and then someone gets up and preaches, and it's nice and quiet, right? Is this not your kind of picture of synagogue services? Or there's Romans around, but the Romans are probably sort of like police officers, so they're there, but as long as you don't break the law, they're relatively harmless. Doesn't some of this creep into your mind? Like, I'm just reading it, and, I tend to think of Jerusalem as flat, because Fargo's flat, and all of these things, and it's just hard to get a picture of what it's like. What was it like for the ordinary Jew to meet a Roman? The best answer I can give you is I don't know. But it's worth thinking about, because a huge piece of this question is that this text is taking us into the midst of the Jewish and Roman question. And what we know from the outside is that the relationship was unsteady. This was called a restive province. I forget if it's one, I think it might be one under the direct jurisdiction of the emperor himself. which meant that it was commanded by a legion, or the military was very involved in civilian government because there were problems that cropped up a lot. Some of it is that the Romans don't send their best and brightest people to Palestine. In the Roman world, it's like getting sent to Bisbee, or something out in the middle of nowhere that's hardly even on the map. And the people in Rome would be like, "You're going where?" It's probably close to Hades or something. They wouldn't, or going now if you got sent to rural Alaska, there's no one out there, there's no hope of salvation. You're in this, they think of it as a backwards province with all these Jews that are cranky about everything. Now, some of that is they're cranky because the Romans didn't send their smart ones. So it's like imagine having a civil government run by the stereotype of the DMV. How can we make your life as difficult as possible? And the Romans, the smart ones are like, well, we could fix this. And the dumb ones are like, we should add more rules. It's going to work out better. Right? So there's something about that in the mix. Judaism is sort of in a place of tension. That there's this tension that stretches all the way back into Jewish history. You have to pull out your thinking caps. One of Judaism's major conflicts in the Old Testament is what? What gets them into lots and lots and lots of trouble?
In the Old Testament?
Yeah. Whether there is one God or a bunch of them. Exactly. And so Judaism has this tension if God is one and you follow him, or if God is many and you follow him. And the problem with the many gods thing in paganism is that it's rather attractive and rather appealing, especially in the physical pleasure sense of appealing. But there's this tension at the heart of it. So they go into exile into Babylon, they start the synagogues, and they start preaching, and they become much more familiar with the scriptures. They start to have scrolls of the books of the Bible that are written and recorded. And in the midst of that, the community kind of fractures. So part of it becomes the Pharisees. Pharisee comes from the word for purity. I think it's from, I forget what it is. Oh, rats. Got to work on my Hebrew. Was trying to think of the Jewish name for the Feast of Tabernacles, too. If anyone can remember that, you can win a bonus point. You can even have an extra brownie right now if you want. But the Pharisees were a purity movement. They're a bit like the Puritans. We are going to save the nation by enforcing our set of rules on everyone. And they take the rules that are applied to priests in much of the Old Testament and apply them to the entire people. So there were rules for priests, for instance, about what kinds of fabric they could wear when they went into the temple, and the Pharisees applied that to the whole people. Now, in large part, you would have to say that Jesus supports the Pharisaical movement. Not the extremes that it's taken to, but the initial push of it is that holiness is important. The call to live a life of holiness, to live in communion with God, is not something secondary. The problem with the Pharisees is that the living in communion with God becomes tied up in national identity. That we are going to save the nation by following the law. And if you don't follow the law, you're attacking the Jewish nation. And the reason why the Romans rule over us now is because not enough of us are following the law. And so for them, following their rules is a matter of life or death. They're a holiness movement, but there's parts of that that very much translate into Christianity. The problem is if you take that to a super extreme and you are like rules about everything and there's not the heart behind it. Christianity has this unique combination between what is inside, what is in your heart, and what is outside and how you act. Now, in some ways, how you act is more important. That's usually where sin lies, is in action. But it's also about the inside. And Christianity, you have to grab onto both. Jesus talks about that. So it's not just that you act, for instance, on impurity and commit adultery, but that you look at a woman lustfully in your heart. So there's an interior dimension to it. That is a sort of unique Christian synthesis. Pharisaism pushed to an extreme becomes just about externals, and the internal doesn't matter. That we would certainly disallow. That's not Christian. Jesus, I think, would argue, and rightfully so, that that's not even Judaism, that the interior is essential. So the Pharisees are this purity movement, this holiness movement, and they seem to, for the most part, want to fight the Romans by completely ignoring them. So in Pharisaism, you can't go into a Roman house. If you pass them in the market, you have to shake the dust off your feet, and all of these things. Like, the best way to address the Roman questions is to live entirely separate, to be away from them. The Sadducees they have the leadership of the temple. Most of the priests are Sadducees. Most of the Sanhedrin are Sadducees. The Sadducees had become a political animal. So the Sadducees were like, yes, Judaism, but we should compromise with the Romans, because if we don't, they'll kill us all. And hey, maybe the Romans aren't so bad. Here, buy my religious things. I sell sacrifices for the temple. When Jesus goes to the Sadducees and he asks them for money, they pull out Roman coins. So the Sadducees have like some strands of Judaism, but it's become very compromised by the political situation. They're probably still like, we should get rid of the Romans, but we're going to get rid of the Romans by becoming political ourselves. And there's a great amount of confusion between religion and state in this part. In fact, oddly enough, one of the most precious pieces of Western history is the separation of church and state. That is a battle that was fought for centuries and is a precious gift. That political power and religious authority should be separate. It's actually a good thing. We live in an age where political power keeps wanting to encroach into religion, and we have to push back, and it doesn't always seem like a good thing. But on the other hand, it's far better that religion isn't political, because then people like to play politics when it comes to things of faith. It causes all kinds of problems. In some cases, it worked out very well, but they're very few. It's one of the old problems with monarchies. If you have a truly exceptional monarch who is virtuous and holy and a good administrator and good at government, it can be the best governmental system on the planet because they have the power and the authority to put in place good systems. The challenge is that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, and the number of holy monarchs is fairly close to zero in all of history in every country in the world. So the Sadducees are sort of this compromise party. The Zealots are probably the biggest ones. The Essenes are sort of like Pharisees, but they live apart. They're a little bit like Jewish monks. They live out in the desert mostly. They have some places in Jerusalem, but they kind of do their own thing, and they're not really too worried about the Romans. They're not too worried about the Pharisees. They just kind of do their own thing. The Zealots are the ones that enter into this. One of the other names for them is the Sicarii. It means the dagger carriers. And at one point, I forget when it is historically, but there's a point where 4,000 of these Jewish zealots come into Jerusalem for one of the feasts, and they basically pull out their daggers from their long robes and stab every Roman that they can see, and then throw their hoods up and try and fade into the crowd. So if that was the situation, what do you think the Roman response would be? they would be rather furious and suspicious of large groups of Jews that get together, because some of them are hiding these daggers and some of them are really out to kill you. And so there's a lot of antagonism between the Romans and the Zealot party. And parts of this idea of zealotry, lots of Jews seem to support at least the idea of getting rid of the Romans. They might not support the actual violence against Romans, but it's in there. It's probably a bit uncomfortable mix. What it means is that Israel at this time is a powder keg. Like, everyone's sort of upset with everyone else, and they're all suspicious that you're trying to kill us. And so the powder keg, if you have a powder keg, the worst thing that you can do is light a match, right? Because it explodes. And shortly after these events, the Jews will break into open rebellion around 65 or 66 AD, and the Romans will come in and kill millions of them. So, in a way, you could say, in the background, this conflict is simmering. Jewish identity, Roman rule, Roman gods. I mean, the Romans, since they sent some non-intelligent people over to Israel, this includes people like Pontius Pilate, statistically, he wouldn't have been the brightest bulb in the bunch. They did things like set up pictures of Roman gods in the temple. Now, if you were trying to not tick off the people that you were ruling over, setting up foreign gods in the midst of their temple is probably not the greatest idea. But they did, many times over. And sometimes, like when the Zealots killed a bunch of people, then the Romans would get mad and they'd come into the temple and they'd set up even more gods. And then the Jews get angrier and they kill more Romans, and you kind of see how it works. So there's tension in the background, and it's really important to feel that and to see it. Russ, did you have a question?
Where do the Gentiles fit in this picture?
That's a great question. Would you do some research? Where do the Gentiles fit in this picture? The best answer I can give is that they fit in all over the place. That ordinary Roman citizens, ordinary Roman people probably mostly want to carry on with their life, and they wonder what the point of all this fight between gods and goddesses is, and why we have to make such a mess of things. Why can't we just drink the wine? It's good wine. Right? Some Gentiles have become, they're called like God-fearing Gentiles. Some of the Gentiles have supported the life of Judaism. The centurion in Capernaum built their synagogue. There's several other, Romans that had become very closely associated with the synagogues. At this time, the other thing is there's Christians around. Jews from all of these different groups had become Christians, along with a pile of Gentiles. And the Christians, where do they fit? That's another great question. Some of them seem very attached to Jewish things. That's a party that seems to be led by James. That party is strongest, probably in Jerusalem. Some Christians are a lot less concerned about the things of Judaism, and they're excited that the Holy Spirit is being poured out on the Gentiles as well, and they're doing Christian things. Some of the Gentiles are mean and wicked and hate the world and want to kill everyone. It's not all that different than the modern world. That vice can be corruptive, and it has this tendency to grow over time. So people that can start off not so bad can end up being really wicked. And it's really sad when you see that. Like people that are jealous of their rival, so they accuse them as a zealot before the Romans, and it's got nothing to do with reality. It's, just a false accusation. Corruption is common. So at this time in this world, if you're wealthy, you pay off the people accusing you and they go away. Maybe they continue to blackmail you. But corruption is common. You pay off the Romans. The Jewish temple priests, for instance, pay off the Roman guards by the tomb. of Jesus to say that his disciples came and took his body away, corruption was common. There's no cameras to record it. You don't see the money changing hands. I mean, today there is corruption, but we do have some systems in place that can check for it, like audits and accountability for finances. And the more audits you have, and the better they are, the more integrity it kind of enforces on the people, because it's like, well, you have this money, you don't have this money, where did this amount go? And, you know, sometimes you can't find it right away, but you can, there are people that can eventually track it down and figure out where you put it. So corruption is common. Like, it's, the whole thing is just a powder keg. And I think that's an important background to see when we're talking about Paul and the conflict with the Jewish people. Because it's uneasy. It'd be a little bit like the situation on the ground in Minneapolis after was it the George Floyd thing? I think that was a Minneapolis one. You know, and there's lots of business owners that are trying to go about their daily duty, and the rioters were doing things like extorting money from them for protection. We won't riot in your spot if you pay us off. I mean, that's a little bit what I think the situation on the ground is like. Now, it's probably not as open as modern day American riots. It's probably not burning down things in the street, because the Romans had no qualms. There's like no protection for you from Roman justice. You know, they don't have, you're not guaranteed a trial. You're not guaranteed the ability to defend your case.
Unless you're Roman.
Well, sometimes. But it depends on what kind of Roman you are and how much money you have. Because in some cases, yes, like Paul plays that card about being a Roman citizen, you're right. But there's lots of times where it probably didn't matter very much. You know, a wealthier person got mad at you and accused you and paid off the judge, and so, you know, yeah, you're a Roman citizen, but what I don't see, I don't have to report. So there's all of this. It's not clearly defined. There's a lot of ingredients in the soup, as you could say. And it's not clear what's going to happen in the end, especially at this point in the life of Paul. Now, if you look at the wider history, probably 6 or 7 years after this, Judaism is going to be nearly wiped off the map in Israel. But at this point, it's not clear what direction it's going to go, because the great Jewish hope, and one of the struggles that early Christianity has, is what kind of Messiah will Jesus be? Most Jews are expecting a political Messiah who will save them from the Romans. Even some of the disciples are expecting a political Messiah that will save them from the Romans. That's not the kind of Messiah Jesus is, but that instinct in Judaism is far deeper than Christianity. So there's a Jewish revolt in the 60s AD. There's another one like 10 or 20 years later. There's another one. And then the biggest one happens, I think, around the 130s. It's called the Bar Kokhba revolt. And that's when the Romans get really angry. They had allowed some things before, but it's sort of like, you people do not stop causing problems. And, you know, eventually people say the squeaky wheel gets, what is it, the squeaky wheel gets oiled? Or gets greased. And it does, that's true, until it squeaks so many times that you rip it off and throw it in the garbage and buy a new one. And eventually that's what the Romans decide to do.
What year did the Romans destroy the temple?
70. 70 is the classic date for the destruction of the temple. So probably, you know, lots of these ancient dates are hard to know exactly. I would say give or take 6 months or a year, and you're probably still in the ballpark. So when we talk about like Paul coming to James and the presbyters, James's concern is about the Jewish Christians, the Jews who had converted to Christianity, who had a very strong sense of Judaism. And this became a challenge for Paul. And it plays into this conflict that's wider for Paul with the people from Asia and northern Greece that are sort of following him around and angry at him for not being Jewish enough. So they enter into this thing. There's this rumor that Paul taught Jews in the diaspora that they no longer needed to follow the prescriptions of the law. Their relationship is still uneasy, and it's surprising because we're already almost 10 years after the Council of Jerusalem, which is classically thought to be in about 50 AD. We talked about that. It's in chapter 15. But the relationship between Judaism and Christianity, and especially Jewish Christians, is uneasy. So James wants to smooth over the problem. And he encourages an act of Jewish piety. Paul, you should demonstrate your Jewish credentials by paying for these 4 Nazarites and cleansing yourself with them. Now this is a pretty significant expense because there were a whole series of sacrifices that have to be offered for these Nazarites, some of which are bulls, which are the most expensive sacrifice. They were the biggest animals. Compared to them, sheep were relatively cheap. But James suggests to Paul that you should show by your life that you live in observance of the law, that you do this action of Jewish piety, that you're not undermining Judaism. So Paul decides to go along with this, and he purifies himself and enters the temple to tell the priests. And he begins a period of 7 days. And in this case, what ends up happening is as the 7 days are nearly completed, so as this week goes by and Paul is almost at the end of it, Jews from Ephesus recognize Paul. These were the grouchy ones that nearly rioted and had been challenged, and now they get there, and their major complaint against Paul is a rumor that he brought a Gentile into the temple. Now, the rumor may in fact be true. We don't know. It's unlikely that Paul did because it was against Jewish law, but he may have been able to look the other way if someone walked into the temple, and there could be truth to it. But if you think of a group of children that plays the game of telephone and you start a rumor, what happens to rumors? They grow and they get bigger. And pretty soon it's not just stuff like Paul brought a Gentile into the temple, but it's probably stuff like Paul proclaimed loudly that Judaism doesn't matter. If you take this and push it more and more extreme, which is often what happens to rumors, they grow over time. So it starts this uproar. Now, one of the things I like the point sometimes of using these passages to look at some things, and here you see this poison of unforgiveness. You could say from a certain perspective that the Jews from Ephesus haven't worked through whatever was going on with Paul. Why do they feel the need to carry their conflict 1,500 miles away and decide that the best thing to do is to have him murdered? That's an amount of hatred that is problematic. But the same thing happens in our lives, maybe not to the same degree, but it's easy to allow resentment that's underneath the surface. This happens all the time in marriage. That things are happening, little things, sometimes they're not a big deal, and eventually a conflict point comes. Something happens. And it's like throwing the match into the powder keg, and all of a sudden all of this stuff that's been under the surface explodes out into the open. You said this and you did this, and on and on and on and on. And it's kind of the same thing that happened here. There's an event that is the lighting of the match, and it's thrown into the powder keg, and now things start exploding. But it's one of the most beautiful things to really ponder, like the gift of forgiveness. That there is a beauty to looking at recognizing, where are these burdens in my heart? Sometimes the most dangerous ones are the ones where you feel like you're right. Where you feel like someone has done something wrong against you. Do they deserve forgiveness? No, not in the sense of justice. But this is where Christianity comes and the power of Jesus comes. Because at the heart of the Christian message is that we crucified Christ and we don't deserve forgiveness, and He decided to forgive us anyway. You see, at the heart of it is not Jesus saying, you should forgive those people who repent. You should forgive those people who reconcile with you. He, in fact, argues against that. He says, even the Gentiles do the same. Rather, you should forgive the one that hurts you. There is so often that we cling to self-righteousness, but I'm not wrong. Except in the case of Jesus, we are. Except in the case of God and our sins. If you want justice, you can have justice, but it isn't going to go well. And you can see how this poison of a broken relationship in Ephesus has now spread to Jerusalem. This hatred has been nurtured and it's grown. Not just you're preaching badly, but we need to wipe you off the map. And I think that's a good lesson for us to take to heart. That we should be suspicious of those places where we feel righteous, where we feel right, where we feel like we're on the right path. And it's not always because we're wrong. That's not what Jesus is after. He's not trying to sort through who's right and who's wrong. But what he's pointing to is that kind of instinct in us is a manifestation of pride. That kind of instinct in us easily leads to pitfalls and traps and powder kegs. And like I said, you can play a video of a marriage for usually less than a week. It only takes a few days, and you could see the same kind of dynamic, like, yep, this is what it's talking about. Lots of friendships. You could watch kids on Sunday. They'll be running around, and one brother will slam the door in his sister's face, and then later the sister will walk by the brother who's eating a donut and